Sure. I'm here in Thailand hosted by Thammasat, working on my dissertation and doing archival research for that dissertation. My dissertation focuses on the economic and environmental history of a portion of a space called Zomia. So it's basically this upland history that I would say stretches from Assam to Yunnan, but across northern Burma, across northern Thailand. And it's loosely framed around Burma's ongoing civil war. It's the longest running ongoing civil war in the world. But it's a much bigger project than just that. So I think the civil war is kind of at the heart of the project. But it basically looks at how this environmental and economic system that I think existed before the British come to Burma gradually gets broken apart and fractured by colonial intervention and colonial blockades and attempts to monopolize economic trade and environmental extraction, and how different indigenous groups and firms basically mount opposition to the British, at first to put that broken system back together, but gradually use violence to actually keep the system broken because it's advantageous. It makes everyone so much more money. And so there's a story here about what drives the Civil War, but there's a larger story about inter-Asian trade zones and inter-Asian kind of economic zones, and this contiguous upland environmental spectrum that I think runs across all these kind of hills and kind of valleys from northern India into southwestern China. Yeah, so I lived in Burma for a number of years, and so that's why kind of the project is framed around Burma, or maybe centered in Burma. But I'm on a number of U.S. government grants. It's not very, convenient to go to Burma for research at this time, and different grant restrictions won't let me go there. So I ended up building this kind of leg of my research as a project kind of encircling Burma, and so spending a lot of time here in Thailand. And I think it's been, at first I kind of decided to come here just because I couldn't go to Burma, and I know there's a lot of Burma scholars here or people working on the region and people in exile. But it ended up being way more rich and fruitful of a research kind of experience than I could have ever hoped for. Obviously, as I said, the project is bigger than just kind of the Burmese Civil War. And so traveling around the north, working here in the National Archives in Bangkok, but also going to these places like Lampang, obviously north of Chiang Mai, focusing on towns like Prayer. There's so much kind of history there that really speaks to just how integrated of a space this upland kind of contiguous zone. If we want to call it Zomia, we can. The Zomia that I deal with is much smaller than kind of the ideated Zomia that's really popular in historiography and scholarship today. But I think it speaks to just how connected these hillways are. I think a lot of people tend to think of difficult terrain, mountains, hills, as basically natural borders that kind of block engagement and relationships between peoples. But actually, I think they're commercial highways. And so there's so much movement kind of around the hills between them, and ways that a town like Prayer is connected to towns many miles away in Burma, and also places in northern India. So I think seeing these kind of interconnections like firsthand, that you can go to a place like Lampang and see all these houses built by Burmese merchants who came with the teak trade, right, with the British, but also finding a grandmother who still speaks Burmese, and with a grandson who's very Thaified, who maybe graduated from Thammasat or something. But seeing kind of these neat connections, and seeing temples with maybe Buddha images from Mandalay or something, kind of somewhere in northern Thailand, and even many more connections to India or up into Yunnan. So it's fascinating to kind of go to these places that are perceived to be remote, but see actually how integrated they are into this kind of larger inter-Asian world. In terms of contributions, I'm really interested in what I would call maybe multi-scalar history, and this is a huge project. So my dissertation kind of focuses on a period of time, I'd say maybe ambitiously from the 1860s into the 1970s. Realistically, it'll focus more on the 1880s and 90s, maybe through World War II, with an epilogue kind of reaching into the 1970s. Still a huge period of time for an historian. So I really like these kind of maybe long duration, big stories. There's a lot of limitations there because, I can't in a single book write about everything that's happened, right? And so you're kind of choosing moments and you're skipping a little bit through time. So that is a severe limit in that there's worries that you could oversimplify the story. But at the same time, I think it gives you more power and leeway to kind of make a really big frame and a really compelling argument. And we've kind of already talked about, maybe we can cut this, but the different schools of history, right? And that I kind of draw on to focus on kind of making this big story as compelling, but still kind of faithful to historical narrative, and not forcing my own kind of ideas onto the narrative. That being said, so I like multi-scalar stories. I think Zomia itself is an experiment in kind of jumping scale. This is actually an article that Willem van Schendel wrote about jumping scale in Southeast Asia. Focusing on, instead of the traditional kind of national history, we actually think about elevation and altitude as a way of kind of resetting our spatial perspectives. And the concept of Zomia essentially is that there's this huge upland expanse that runs, all from the Himalayan foothills down into Vietnam, essentially, and that all these people who live in the hills, whether they're hill tribes or people who migrated there, they share traits in common with each other, more so than they share traits with their lowland kind of kin or neighbors. And so it's kind of pushing away from national history and thinking more about regional history, interregional histories, and really just shifting perspective and jumping scale, so to speak. And so I really am interested in that. I'm drawing a lot more on actually scholarship that comes out of South and Central America. There's I think he's an anthropologist named John Murrah, who basically wrote about pre-colonial Incan Andes civilization, and he's writing in the 1960s. But he thinks about how economies and kinship kind of work up and down the mountain, right? So in the Andes, you have different kind of Incan communities living at different elevations up and down the mountain. They generally develop into, outputting one specific commodity. And then they have family members kind of travel and move into each elevational level so that you have kin in kind of each space. And then you're trading between these elevational zones. So obviously the Andes are not quite the same as the hills of Zomia, right? These are much smaller hills and pockets and depressions and plateaus and valleys. But I'm trying to kind of apply the same concept that we have. Basically, Murray called this the vertical archipelago. So I'm thinking about what is the Southeast Asian kind of analog to the vertical archipelago, and how does that push us away from kind of writing Burmese history, Thai history, Indian history, into kind of this multi-scalar, multi-elevational zone history where we have communities that are spread out, logging teak, mining for gems, growing tea, growing rice, and kind of trading all between them. And how does that kind of recenter our focus into what I think, what we could call like an inter-Asian trade zone. So this is a very long kind of meandering answer. I apologize, but I think it's this concept of, if you can write a multi-scalar narrative, it also can serve as this multi-scalar project, that the narrative is tracking maybe a few different stories at the same time throughout the whole book. So each chapter, maybe we kind of are jumping through different settings. And then that gives you kind of a sense of how the story is evolving at different scales, at different levels, over kind of the longue durée, over time, from I think my project is set with the opening of this upland frontier from the eyes of the British with the creation of the Colonial Forestry Department in Burma, to the closing of that frontier, essentially with the rise of lowland Burmese air power and kind of the creation of an air force, which changes the relationship between lowland and upland people. But so again, Burma's the frame, but it kind of reaches out into India and into China and into kind of former Lana spaces as well. So it's a lot of it's centered around forests and teak, but it also looks at kind of how other commodities come into the story.